Um, well, yes, continue. It is recorded. So I want to say thank you for that. Two things. I've been to Glacier, but on the Waterton side, on the other side. This is a number of years ago now. I think it was about 10 or 15 years. And this is when I was a Canon National Park Science Scholar. And then we had a retreat there, which was really stunning. But I have also been to Montana a couple of times. And the last time was just a few years ago. And I believe the university there had me, I spoke at a theater in town, and it was I'm just blanking on where I was because if you said it, I would know that's where I was.
You were at the Wilma.
Is that Missoula. Where I was?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the old theater, and they had my name. I was like, oh my God, my name is literally up in lights. That's what I'm talking about. Anyway, and Montana was beautiful and stunning. And I hope I get a chance to get back out there again, especially when the weather's nice.
Well, and I'm going to hand it off to you. But before I do, I want to just take a minute to send our condolences to the Blackfeet Nation as they mourn the loss of Earl Oldperson. I had the privilege of working with Earl and getting to know him, and the world has lost a truly great leader. So it is with somewhat of a heavy heart that that we join this topic today. But I know that it is absolutely a topic that Earl would not want us to miss out on, in which he would want us to bring great joy and attention. So with that, Carolyn, again, thank you, and I hand it off to you. We are putty in your hands.
Okay. Oh, I love that. 1 hour. Ooh, thank you. And yes, I hope to do Earl right, as he would, as I would say. So I'm gonna put up some images. So this is what I'm gonna do, so everybody out there in the audience knows. For the next maybe 30 minutes, I know many of you have read the book, so I'm not actually going through the book because you've read the book or you've engaged it on some degree. But what I want to do is create a larger container to put the book in. So if you're thinking about, what this looks like in connection to the moment that we're in, what this looks like in connection to your own life, and just, I want to call out my own subjectivity, right? This is based on my own perspective. Yes, I did research and all that, but at the end of the day, all knowledge is subjective. And so I'm bringing myself to the work in a very particular way. And so let me put some images up there for you, because that's just always fun. All right. Make sure everybody can see. Oh, I forgot that was there. Nice. Okay. That's going to be on some screens. I call this one Black Faces, White Spaces, and Playing the Long Game. Yeah, that picture is me this summer in the house I grew up in, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I always, lately, when I've been doing this talk, well, here's what you should know about me. There's things you need to know about me. Is that I stand at this intersection of arts, education, and lived experience, because I spent 11 years as an actor professionally. I dropped out of school, did that for 11 years in New York and LA back in the 80s, spent 5 years, the better part of it, backpacking around the world and mostly ending up in Nepal at the end there, and then returning to school to get 3 degrees with no intention of actually staying in academia. The idea was, how can I bring those 3 pieces of the way I show up and meet the world together and stand in that place, and then have this conversation publicly to tell these stories around issues that are really challenging to talk about. I mean, I ain't even gonna front, as they say, as the young people say, because the reality is that, you bring up words like race, diversity, difference, power, privilege. If you say things like white supremacy or any of that kind of stuff, I know stuff comes up, because stuff comes up for me too. And so I was just really interested about, how do I meet people where they are? How do we have these conversations together? Not want to make one of us right and one of us wrong, but really try to create an emergent space for something new, bringing how we each know the world to these issues at hand, particularly as they have to do with the environment broadly defined. So I always start lately with this slide. Now, I should tell you that since May of 2020, so I've been building this platform for a number of years. This book came out in 2014. I was already trying to build that before, but at the time I had a full-time job as a professor at UC Berkeley, and then I went to University of Kentucky full-time. But by the time I hit about 2015, I was teaching classes and on a plane almost every week. I only do this work and engage with people if I'm invited, because there's a degree of accountability I think it's important for people to have to invite me in the room to say some things that I want to say. But when George Floyd got murdered last year, and Christian Cooper got his skin weaponized against him when he walked into Central Park to do birding. The Guardian asked me to write a piece last June. And when that piece came out, while the beginning of the shelter in place, March, April, I watched 70% of my income evaporate because that's also how I make a living. So I had my residency at Middlebury, which was part-time. For a while there, I thought, oh my God, I just watched everything evaporate. Who knows what's going to happen next? People shifted to virtual. George Floyd got murdered. Christian Cooper walked in Central Park. I wrote that piece. I've never worked so much in my life. And I mean, the invitations, it's just been nonstop. So I can tell you roughly since last May 2020, I've done more than 150 engagements online, and that is underreporting. I'm not talking about the writing, I'm not talking about the classes, I'm just talking about people asking me to engage in multiple capacities. And what I like to say to people is, one, that I feel immense gratitude that I can work and make a living. It's something I believe in and that I love. And I know a lot of people have suffered this year, including members of my own family around that. And I will say that I'm also exhausted. I'm exhausted because there's a lot of emotional labor in this work because it's personal. And my hope is that it's personal for everyone at some level, but I can only speak for myself and say that it's there. So I'm continually thinking about how I can shift and evolve, and what do we need to do around self-care to continue to be up to show this work and be in better relationship with each other on this earth in which we live. So I'm looking down at my notes to make sure I have so many things I want to say in 30 minutes. I was thinking about a few months ago when the trial of Derek Chauvin, the man who had his knee on his George Floyd's neck for all that time, when the verdict came down, and I was watching CNN, and Jake Tapper and Don Lemon. Jake Tapper is the white newscaster, Don Lemon, the black newscaster, the friends that were talking. And Jake Tapper said to Don Lemon, in 2016, when Black Lives Matter, all the stuff was coming out, politicians, famous people were really careful. They didn't even want to say Black Lives Matter, let alone white supremacy or privilege or whatever the words were. Nobody wanted to say them in public. And he said, now in 2020, everybody's saying it. You can find, and people are writing it, people are coming out on social media. No one seems to be afraid. So he looked at Don Lemon and said, don't you think there's been a sea change in terms of, what's happening here? What Don Lemon responded to him and said, well, I think there's been a sea change in terms of awareness, but there hasn't been a sea change in terms of practice. And that's really that tension that I'm really interested in, because I agreed with him. I think that it's really important to be, the current term is to say one is woke, but to be awake, to be aware. None of us knows everything, and all of us have things to learn. So we come to this in different ways at different times. And there's something about this collective moment of COVID and the political atmosphere and just the time that we're living in, the environmental issues that are happening right now that are bringing many of us to this conversation in a really different and intense way. But there is a difference between the two, because it's good to be aware and it's good to be awake. But what does that mean in terms of how you translate that? Because it's actually going to cost you something. So that's a little bit about what I want to put out there. One of the things I talk about in the book is the question of representation, because I'm always thinking about that. I always ask the question, whose story counts? I actually believe that all of our stories have value. All of our stories operate in relationship to each other, but over time, in the past, in the present, media, education, legislation, what's clear to me is that every story isn't valued in the same way. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2017, this photographer, Chris Buck, he did a series of photographs. He said, let's talk about race. And I believe it might have been in Oprah's, for Oprah or something. I can't remember exactly who he did it for, but this is one of the images, and it kind of speaks for itself here. You see this young girl of European descent standing, looking at a series of shelves with all the dolls on it being black or brown. He also did an image of a salon where women and perhaps men go and get their nails done. And all the women sitting in the chairs getting their toes done are of Asian descent. All the women who are actually giving the pedicure are of European descent, and so on. So you really start to get the feeling of, okay, so what we're doing is we're flipping the script. which what does it mean to flip the script? Not flip the script to diminish the experience, say, of this young girl. I don't want to diminish anybody's, but what happens if we just shift it for a minute? What shifts for each of us in our minds, in our hearts, in how we show up? Oh, I forgot my little, that's right, flipping the script. One of my favorite, I'm a big sci-fi fan, big fantasy fan. I watched a lot of television this last year. I live alone here in Burlington, and I love movies and television series. So I was watching everything, but this was one of my favorites, which was on HBO. It was called Lovecraft Country. It's based on the novels of H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote science and what he called weird fiction. And I'm not going to give away, for those of you who haven't watched it, I say, please put it on your watch list. But this was in the very first episode. So it is set, the story is set in the 1950s, right after the Korean War. But it centers on this extended African-American family. You're seeing three of the characters in that family. Main characters are here in this car. It starts off in Chicago. They're kind of a working class and slightly middle class family, more working class. And there's a scene where this car is sitting out front. They're getting ready to go on this adventure. They're going to drive all the way to Massachusetts from Chicago because they've heard they have these white relatives who are witches, and all that kind of stuff is happening. So what you're seeing from them is the kind of excitement you'd see from any group of human beings who are about to do a major road trip. This is an adventure. They're nervous. They're excited. They're packing up their car with all they need. The nuance that was different is that the matriarch of the family, who wasn't going to be joining them, she had to stay home to take care of this young child, was standing in front of the car, and she had a little notebook she pulled out. And she's like, hey, like, settle down, y'all. Let's make sure you have everything. And what she was doing was referencing the Green Book, which was a very real thing, because this is during Jim Crow, right? So 1950s, Jim Crow, if you're non-white, in particular, if you are Black, you are not just moving it wherever you want, whenever you feel like it. You need to make sure you have everything on you. Do you have food? Do you have stuff to sleep with? Do you know where to go if you have to go to the restroom? I mean, where can you spend the night in a hotel? You might not be able to. So it was just a way for them to do a checklist. It was almost a throwaway moment, but it was so clear. A little bit further in that scene, they're further down the road. And I think they're in Massachusetts at this point, but they're not at their destination. They get pulled over right before sundown by this white state trooper, who we've already heard is not a nice guy. He pulls them over. They're really nervous. He comes up to them. He says, do you know where you are? He says, because you are in a sundown county. You have approximately, I don't remember what he said, 7 minutes before he says, if you have 7 minutes to get out of this county, if you don't, I can't guarantee what's going to happen to you, right? And so you see them, they're very scared. Sundown towns are a real thing. We're a real thing in this country, right? If you were non-white after sundown in certain towns in this country, you could be beaten, killed, who knows what could happen to you, right? I am giving away the spoiler. They make it. And later you see them fighting real monsters in the woods, real ugly, big monsters with big, ugly teeth. The whole thing is going crazy, right? The point that I want to make, one of the things that blew me away, was that they managed to tell this Indiana Jones, Lara Croft Tomb Raider type adventure story with witches and monsters, with Black people at the center that actually understood to be Black in the United States in the 1950s. You can't tell that adventure without actually referencing what it meant to be Black at that time. You can't do it. I mean, you simply couldn't do it in any realistic way, which made it all the much more powerful when they centered that experience in this very human story about what it means to make these magical discoveries and so on and so forth. One of the things that I say to people all the time is, the question of who do you stand with? This has probably been like 7, 8 years ago now, but when I was living in California in the Bay Area, I was at the airport at SFO, San Francisco. And I was getting ready to board the plane, and in front of me, there was a South Asian woman. She was quite petite, and there was 2 white women standing behind me, and we're all like smiling and getting ready to get on the plane. And suddenly the flight attendant says, I'm sorry, but there's been a delay. You know when that happens, and then you all kind of look at each other in the line and say, oh my God, and then you start talking. So myself, the 2 white women, the South Asian woman, we're all talking to each other. And we find out, everybody's saying, so what do you do? What do you do? And I'm kind of talking about what I do. And the South Asian woman says, well, what I do is I go around to businesses around the world and talk about diversity. I've been to 75 countries. And she's saying this really, so she got a real serious look on her face, right? So I'm like, wow, like seriously impressed. And I said, and I must have said something about the power of empathy or something I must have said. I don't remember what I said, but I remember her response. And what she said was, empathy and sympathy are nice, but who do you stand with? And that kind of, like I went, whoa, when I got on the plane, I whipped out my notebook, I wrote it down. Like, she's right. Empathy and sympathy are nice, and I feel important and valuable to have. But the question of who do you stand with, for me, brought up a whole lot of other questions. Who do you stand with means you've got to know something about where you stand. Because for me, if I am to have any integrity in a relationship with you or anyone else, I got to be clear. I got to be clear because we're all biased. And bias isn't the same as prejudice or as a racism. They kind of operate there in relationship to each other. But bias is a point of view, right? It's a perspective that you got because of how you were brought up, where you were raised, where you went to church, whatever it is. All those things that have influenced who you are, right, gave you a point of view. It's not about being right or wrong, but it is about being clear. Because if I'm going to stand with you, how do I do that honestly? How do I do that with integrity? Again, I'm not even interested so much in us agreeing as much as I'm interested in how we can come together honestly to think about where is it that we want to go. So I always have to start off with my own story. And I think I talk about it for like a page and a half in the book. I grew up, that's me, like with my dad. I always have to start with my parents, actually. So Rose and Henry over there in the corner. That picture was taken in the 1950s. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia. They grew up very poor. Both came from large families. Both their mothers had been maids in white households. Lots of issues, lots of brothers and sisters. When my father went to fight in the Korean War, when he came back, he tried to get a job. And he said one of the jobs he tried to get in Virginia was he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. And he thought that looked like a great government job. So he went to apply. Now you figure, veteran, but this was the 1950s. And he said what they told him was that, I'm sorry, but we don't hire Negroes. So my parents, like many African Americans who lived in the South at that time, decided to come north because they thought they'd have better job opportunities. And he went to New York. He went to New York because he had a sister there who was a nurse, who had married. This Black contractor seemed to be doing well. And when they got to New York, my father had two job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of New York City. But the job he ended up taking was at 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. There was a 12-acre estate, and you're going to see some images here, belonging to a very wealthy Jewish family who happened to own a lot of real estate. And what they needed was full-time caretakers for this property, people that are going to live on this property, be the landscape gardener, the chauffeur, the sometime housekeeper. So this is the job my parents took. I'm going to show you multiple pictures of this estate, which is stunning. It had a swimming pool, a small pond with fish in it, apple trees, peach, pear, plum trees, flower gardens. It was simply a stunning piece of property. The house you saw in the early picture was the gardener's cottage where my parents lived. And there's a larger house that the owners would come up to on weekends and holidays. My parents wanted to have kids, but thought they couldn't have kids because of something that had happened to my mother years earlier. And so with the help of the owners, they adopted me. And I was adopted from Spence Chapin, which is an adoption agency in New York City. And then what I always like to say to people is they relaxed and had my first brother and did some more relaxing and had my second brother. This neighborhood was incredibly wealthy. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer, we lived next door to them. Harry Winston had property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. So you start to get the idea of the wealth in the area. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 1990s when a Japanese American woman moved in. She was there for a little while, then she moved out. This is where my brothers and I, this is the bigger house where the owners would come up to. This is where my brothers and I learned how to swim, ride our bikes, play in the woods, all that stuff that many of us who are fortunate enough are able to do in outdoors, in an outdoors that was simply stunning. It was like having our own private park during the week when the owners weren't there. But the story that I always tell people, that when I started to get a sense of what it meant to look like me and my family and live in this neighborhood, was when I was 9. I went to a public school there, Memorial Public School, This is the days you could walk home from school and your parents didn't worry about it. And I was right around the corner from the house. And so it was after school. I'm 9 years old, right? I got my little school bag, and there were policemen always patrolling this area, 2-lane road. And this white policeman, as I'm around the corner from the house, stopped me and asked me where I was going. And I gave him the address. I said, 1,000 Old White Plains Road. And he paused for a second and then looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" I'm thinking, I'm 9, what? But I just said, no, I live there. I was confused. And then he let me go. I went home, told my parents. My father called the police station and he really gave them hell about it. They never bothered me and my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to ask the question of the logics behind that. I was this little girl, time of day, all the things you might think would register as, oh, does she need help? She's a little girl, she must be coming home from school. Didn't seem to register for him. He was trying to figure out, what would I be doing here? And it's hard for me to interpret it differently. I want to jump ahead till the 1990s. So the patriarch of the family had died many years earlier, the owner, but the matriarch was alive. At this point in the 90s, my parents had been caring for this land full time for 40 years. And she was very sick. And so she had to start thinking about what's going to happen to my family. Me and my brothers have grown up. We no longer live there, but when we go home for holidays and visits, this is where we come to visit our parents. She thought about trying to keep them on this land. This property was worth over $3 million. I think I mentioned this in the book. At the time, the property taxes were over $125,000 a year. My dad was only making something like $25,000 a year. So them staying on the property wasn't really a thing, even though I heard for a second the owner considered trying to keep them on this property. So at the end of the day, she had a beautiful house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. And the reason they picked Leesburg is because at this point, my youngest brother was married, having kids, and very settled there. And since I will never be settled, it's really hard to consider where I will be. And my other brother was moving around all the time as well. So my parents moved into this house in 2003. And I always tell people I watched my father in particular get more and more depressed, because now they've been caring for this land for nearly 50 years. And he talks about missing the land and missing home. About 5 or 6 years after they moved, they received a copy of a letter from one of their old neighbors. And the letter was from the Westchester Land Trust, which was letting everyone in the old neighborhood know that a conservation easement had now been placed on this piece of property. It's also why there's now a gate on this driveway. What you're seeing was never there when we lived there. And what I understood about the easement, and I got a copy of the letter, it was letting everybody know the environmental values of this place. All the flora and fauna on the property, where it sits in the watershed, the importance of protecting it. And what I understood is that it was protected in perpetuity. At the end of the letter, the land trust thanks the new owner for his conservation mindedness. But there's nothing in the letter acknowledging my parents who cared for this land for nearly 50 years. And just like that, we were gone from the environmental history. My parents in particular, their labor, their love, their time, our presence, right? And that's really back in 2003 when I started thinking about all the people who've been forgotten in the history of land, stewardship, forestry, parks, rivers, who've always been there, who are still there, whose ancestors were there, who we don't talk about, who we don't see, who we don't value, whose stories we don't know, which actually not only tell us something about them, but also tell us something about us. And how can we think about that a little differently? So I think at this moment, zipping back now, we're in 2021 as this kind of, 2020, the never ending year of 2020. I think of this moment as a moment of convergence, right? Because it's always a moment of convergence. And I often put this up here where you can see images of slavery and Japanese internment and native removal and the pollution done to the land and immigrants crossing the border. And I purposely put them up there with the famous images of Gifford Pinchot, the guy with the big mustache, who really the idea of conservation and forest management was his idea back in the late 1800s, along with John Muir, who as a conservationist, along with President Roosevelt, came up with this idea of wilderness national parks and thinking about how they might protect these spaces. And I'm not here to diminish any one of these men. I mean, for me, these men were in part thoughtful, committed, engaged in very particular ways that have influenced me as well as you I feel like I can safely say. The question that I ask is, well, that's really interesting. What else was going on around the same time? So these universal statements that they're making about this space and the way we should engage it and what we should be doing, I'm always like, well, who is the we that they're talking about? Because they're having this conversation in 1903 on Overhanging Rock in Yosemite, Muir and Roosevelt. And Gifford Pinchot, 1897, 1898, 1899, he's having these ideas about forest management. I'm going, well, let's see, 1862, the Homestead Act is happening. For me, is probably the most important legislation around our relationship to land. Well, when that gun goes off at midnight, for the most part, if you were of European descent, you could kind of run out there, put your stake down on 160 acres. And if you stayed on it for 5 years, if you farmed, if you built a house, if you made it through 5 years, that land was suddenly yours, free and clear, right? Free and clear. And land is never just about land. It is about legacy. It is about economic and political power. It is about the right to say that you belong. And I want to be really clear about something. I'm not interested in diminishing the experience of European immigrants. Something like 60% of them didn't make it because it was really hard. That was the great risk that many of them took to come over here and try out living their dreams for themselves and their family. And you could die from the common cold and you could die from loneliness. I can't imagine how hard it would be. But I have to also ask, whose land was that before theirs? All the indigenous people who had to be killed and or removed in order for people of European descent to have that opportunity. It's complicated, right? No matter how far down the road we get, all this land will always be stolen. I can say it gently, which is what I try to do, but I have to say it forcefully because it's true. There's a reason why a lot of the indigenous community are still having the same fight they've been having for 400 to 500 years. There's a reason why, there's a legacy for that. So we don't even have to talk about Black people. But what if we throw enslaved Africans in? Because 3 years later, after the Homestead Act, the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're originally given 400,000 acres of land until white plantation owners said, we've just given these people who were our property 400,000 acres of land. And land is never just about land. It's about economic and political power. It is about legacy. And it is about the right to say that you belong. So I don't think so. And they took all that land back. Now, you did have some African-American homesteaders, but nowhere at the numbers of European immigrants at the same time. So just in talking about indigenous people very generally, African-Americans very generally, and European immigrants very generally, we start to see how complex it gets. We don't even have to talk about the 3,000 Chinese immigrants who built the railroad and who were left out of the final image of the Golden Stake in that history. We don't have to talk about the Japanese immigrants who we put into internships and in intern camps, the Mexicans crossing the border into New Mexico, and what happened with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1863, when the US government did not honor the right of those immigrants to live on that land as they please. And it goes on and on and on, that legacy. And what we also know about us as human beings, we don't all stay in our isolated groups defined by our history, ethnicity, or race. We cross, we mix, we engage, because that's who we are. So if you bring that into the mix, excuse me, it gets even more complicated to think about how we show up at this time, at this moment of convergence. Dang, I'm not even paying attention to my notes, but I'm doing okay. So it's where I ask the question, what is it that we're trying to sustain? Because for me, sustainability at its heart, at its core, is about relationship. It's about our relationship, yes, to that non-human nature out there in the world, but also our relationship to each other. One is not separate from the other. The we who is making decisions about how we engage that park, that river, that mountain, that ocean side. The we means, for me, in the best sense, that we've actually got some kind of solid understanding of who each other is and what our collective stories are in order to think what we want to be as we move forward, particularly in relationship to nature. Which is why I think that, and all I'm saying from the book here, the first chapter, Bamboozled, is why I think we've been bamboozled with an environmental narrative that is not wrong. I'm not saying the narrative is wrong, but it is highly incomplete. It talks about nature as though racism and other levels, other kinds of inequities and injustices don't happen as soon as you hit the park gate. Somehow the idea, I like to think of it like wildlife. People joke that if you have signs around park spaces or wilderness spaces for humans, don't go here, can't cross over here, wildlife isn't paying any attention. They're going where they need to go and how they're going to go. Racism isn't paying any attention either, right? Because it's embedded in us. It's embedded in our institutions. It's embedded in multiple ways. Most of these institutions got created during Jim Crow. So how could it not be embedded in a very particular way, right? Like, how could it not be? I'm not saying that there hasn't been some shifts over time, but I don't even have to tell any of y'all, in 2020, when things have exploded like they did, they would have never exploded like that if there was nothing to explode around, right? It's like dealing with every sector of our society. I always say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. We are all privileged. We're all just not privileged in the same way at the same time, right? And to understand how that operates, privilege doesn't make you a bad person, doesn't make me a bad person. But there's some degree of responsibility, accountability, awareness, and willingness to change that I think really challenges some people around what does it mean to try to hold on to their privilege or try to let it go and change it up. I often, in my conversations with organizations and institutions lately, have been saying that, with respect to many of these institutions where people have done some good work, where there's some good ideas there. And I'm always saying that, well, we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we might actually need a new bathtub. One of the most challenging places for me is when people say, well, we want to invite you to the table. We want to invite me to the table. And I can tell people have good intentions. Let me just call it really plain. A predominantly white group says to a non-white person, because I'm privileging race here, but there's all kinds of difference that we could be talking about. I'd like to invite you to the table to sort of participate. And they mean it. And it's heartfelt. And what I usually say is that, well, they bring you to their table, make space for you at the table. And then what usually happens is me, have to learn everything about that table. The culture, the language, the mission statement, the way things are done. But actually, no one around the table has to learn anything about me. And therefore, nothing changes, right? This is why I say this is not about a relationship of reciprocity. If you invite difference in, then you've got to be ready to be different, which means you've probably got to get rid of the table, And that's what makes it, I think, so unsettling for so many people. What I can really appreciate as a fellow human being is the idea that you too are going to have to be uncomfortable. If you tell me you're comfortable and are doing this work, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say it with love, then you're probably not doing the work. Because I can tell you I'm not comfortable. There's nothing comfortable about change, which isn't the same as feeling a sense of security and safe. I want people to be safe. But this work is actually asking us to contend with a legacy that has been around for over 400 years, things we have never fully attended to. We've just built upon and built upon and built upon. And for me, one of the brilliant things about this moment of convergence, is we have an opportunity to actually do something different. When I hear people say, when are we going to go back to normal? I want to say, I don't want to go back there. I understand there's things that I miss from that too. But the normal for whom? Like for me, this is an opportunity for us actually to enter the I don't know place together and come up with something different. So the last thing I want to say before I open it up, well, two things I want to say. Well, yes, two things. The first I want to say is the idea for me is that we're playing the long game. Like this, there isn't an end game. We're going to make these changes and then we're done. Because change for me is the long game. And I put up this image from Robert S. Duncanson when I was watching the inauguration. One of the things that popped out to me is when Senator Roy Blount presented then the newly minted president, Joe Biden, with this painting. And, at first I wasn't really, I was kind of looking, I was looking at another one of those bucolic landscape paintings from the 1850s, I'm thinking to myself. But it was when Senator Blount said, this man who painted this in 1859 was African American. And I went, what, in 1859? Because what got me was that he painted this with a rainbow. And, rainbows symbolize hope, potential, possibility. This was a Black man living during the time of slavery in the United States. I read that this man suffered from mental illness, often had to go across the border into Canada. I can't imagine it because what I said to somebody the other day, I said, because we collectively, I believe we're suffering from mental illness. I don't know how you enslave people without suffering on some level from mental illness, but he was holding that in his body in a very particular way, and yet still believed in the possibility of who we can be. I was born exactly 100 years after he painted this. And I like to think that he was playing the long game in a very particular way. So the last thing I want to say is ask the question of risking to gain. What risks are we willing to take, right? For me, the big thing here is not taking a risk in order to not lose something, which is something we may be inclined to do as human beings. You want to hold on to the thing you have. So what risk do I take so to keep it? Which is, for me, not a place of power, but taking a risk in order to gain something, which means there's a letting go. The idea that it's not about being comfortable. A number of years ago on NPR, Michelle Martin engaged Svetlana Alexievich because she had just won a Nobel Prize for her work on Belarus, and she's from Belarus, and she talked about Chernobyl in her work. And Michelle Martin was saying to her, you really called out a lot of your own people, man. You called out your government. They're really upset with you. And did she feel bad about that? And she said, Svetlana Alexievich said, I love my people, but I'm not interested in them being comfortable. I'm interested in them being better. So I sort of want to open up the conversation about, whatever questions you have from the book, things that I just said, how you ground yourself in this moment, and how we might think about how we might move forward.
Wow, that's just an incredible way to start this evening. Thank you so much. I was particularly taken with this idea of the bathtub/table, because I think frankly, it's one of my challenges, one of our challenges as a group. There's not a lot of color in this group, and you really hit the nail on the head. We try and work very closely with our tribal neighbors.
Yeah.
But in large part, it is a one-way invitation, right? And so we invite people to our room and our table, and so that's very helpful in helping me personally think through how we begin to change, to grow, to really be more authentic in this work. So I know also, Jill, there are already questions in the chat. Folks, please fill up the chat. We have the opportunity to visit with an incredibly dynamic national leader on these issues, and nothing's off the table, and there are no stupid questions. So
thank you. You took it right out of me. I was going to say there are only good questions.
Right.
Exactly. The challenge will be if there are no questions, actually.
Yeah, no, there definitely are already. And Jill, if you want to kind of launch, I have a couple as well that I noted going forward.
Yeah, we have a couple questions in the chat so far for you, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Michael says, this may be answered, but I'm interested in any specific acts of indicating who you stand with.
Yeah, how do you do that? How do you do that? How do I demonstrate who I stand with?
Okay, I got it. Yes, okay. Well, for me, part of it, I can come at this from a number of different ways. Part of it is practice, right? This is walking your talk when we use that phrase, right? How I think about, so let me say this to you. One of the things that happened for me last year, I told you the front half of the story. I didn't tell you the back half of the story because it would just take me longer of what happened. What has since happened in the last year, because my parents own that piece of land and their story getting erased, a story I've told 1,000 times, really. In short, what happened between the New York Botanical Gardens reaching out, between a documentary filmmaker, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who was making a documentary for HBO on trees, between the Westchester Land Trust themselves, all of us in conversation, the goal was to, get me back on that estate. I hadn't been on it in 18 years because I don't have access anymore. And one of the stories I had told the documentary filmmaker was about a weeping cherry tree that my father had given my mother for her 40th wedding anniversary, but they had to leave it on the property. Obviously, they couldn't take it with them. And both the New York Botanical Gardens and the Land Trust and the filmmaker thought, well, what if we could get a grafting of the tree? We could film you doing it, bring that to New York Botanical Gardens and tell the story there. And I was so moved by them wanting to stand with me around that and were willing to use the privilege that they have to figure out how that would happen. Now, for a moment, we were all really excited and we were watching this. The filmmaker is going to use my story along with 4 others to talk about trees and people in North America. It was going to be a whole thing. Until we found out in December of 2020, when the Land Trust finally got on the land, that the tree had been cut down. It was no longer there. And for about 3 or 4 days, I was really, I can actually show you, I should show you a picture of it. Sorry, I had it up there and I should have left it there. Let me just do this real quick so you can see. So ignore that for a second. So that's the tree behind my parents in 2003. So you can see the weeping cherry tree, right? And this is the picture I had sent the Land Trust again. I said, here's the tree next to the fuchsia hydrangea, so you know where it is. It's near the house. Because for some reason, the Land Trust didn't have it in their records. And what I understood much later is everything is not protected in a conservation easement. There are selective pieces of that easement that are protected. It's something I discovered. And so I sent them this. Well, in December, this is the picture he sent me back. Everything had been landscaped. Now the owner who came on while my parents were still there was no longer the owner anymore. Now there was a new set of owners, right? So I was devastated. We all were devastated. We thought, well, this is it. So there's going to be no film, no story, no accountability. On the 4th day, I thought, what if I can get everybody to agree that we're going to get on this property and we're all going to replant a new tree? Because what happens then is that everyone becomes accountable for it. The Land Trust, the New York Botanical Gardens is a major institution, the filmmaker, as well as myself. And that is, for me, one way to think about who do you stand with. And I'm here to tell you, they all agreed. And they couldn't get the new owners to respond to any of their emails. And I wrote them, they're a pair of medical doctors who are married, this husband-wife couple. And I wrote them a personal letter. And I never used the word race once. But I really told her about my parents and this idea of the story. She wrote me back in 20 minutes and said they'd be honored to have me on the land. So on July 18th, we all got on there and filmed that, that experience. And that's a kind of soft example for me of who you stand with, because all of them had to put they all have, as far as I'm concerned, more. The HBO filmmaker and her Emmys and her film team could have chosen any other story. The Westchester Land Trust, the president of the Land Trust came on that day, along with one of her foresters, Brian, to help plant the tree. And they actually provided the tree. I was ready to pay for the tree. They provided for the tree. The owner, one of the owners, was there and participated, because that for me was really important. I did not want her to feel like they had no idea what we discovered when we got on the property. All the flower gardens, all the vegetable gardens, all the fruit trees had all been cut down by the previous owner, because now they no longer had anybody caring for this property full time. So they got rid of everything that needed that full-time attention. So this owner that I was meeting had no idea. I had to show her images of what the property looked like before. She had no idea. So part of knowing who to stand with, in part, it is relationship. It is, for me, I believe there's a bit of radical opening of one's heart, meaning how radically vulnerable are you willing to be? And I mean, I don't mean that in any, soft way. I mean it for real, like as a place of power, letting people know that, it was interesting for me to be with a major institution that, like the New York Botanical Gardens, who said they were stumbling over how to make the, and I usually do it at the beginning of my talk. I honor the fact that I'm on the home of the traditional Abenaki people here. They had stopped doing that in New York Botanical Gardens because they were so afraid of doing the wrong thing. Like, the thing that I always like to remember is that no matter how big the institution or how powerful the organization or how rich the individual or a group of individuals are, we are always talking about people. We are talking about people and all their imperfection. And it's, for me, there's no expectation that everybody's going to know. But who you stand with in part is the step that you're willing to take. And when you make that mistake, and I will guarantee you will make it, not because you're white, but because you're human. For me, it is how you still show up anyway to attend to the impact of that. That is, for me, who you stand with. You show up even though the door may be slammed in your face, because people got their own stuff. Because, and I'm just going to say this to all of you, just because somebody's Black or brown doesn't mean they have it all together and figured out. I'm here to tell you that ain't true. Because when you're dealing with people who are also dealing with anger, hurt, deep mistrust of a system and a way of living, and they've got 400 years to prove it. Everything from redlining to Jim Crow to indigenous removal. I can keep going, right? All gentrification, everything. USDA, not lending to Black people, eminent domain. We have so many examples. We spend the whole time. That's not an excuse, but that means you're going to have a people that are wounded. And if you ask me the truth, we are all wounded. For me, the real story is we are all wounded. It's just some of us show up in that woundedness in a different way. So for me, it's also about the potential of reconciliation, redemption, and accountability. I'm not interested in cancel culture. For me, there's nothing. Can we cancel it, please? Because really, it doesn't gain anybody anything. I understand the anger, but really, canceling one person out, I tell people all the time, the person I really want to speak to in the Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper thing is Amy Cooper. I'd love to meet Christian Cooper. He's a great guy. I get Christian. I want to speak to Amy because the potential for growth for her, I can't imagine how challenging that must have been to be ostracized in that way in public. And I don't mean she shouldn't have been held accountable. Oh, yes, she should have. But really, to what end? If all we're going to do is say the thing and let her dangle out there as though she represents every person of European descent and everything that's gone wrong for 400 years. She does not, right? And actually ostracizing her lets everybody else off the hook to not do the work of who do you stand with and how do you show up and how do we practice that, right? So that's really what I went off there. Oh, I went off on that question. Sorry, I should stop talking now.
Oh no, you're doing great. In fact, your fan club is growing by the minute. And Jill, I know we've got a lot of comments as well, and I want to make sure we're able to kind of go through some of those comments because they're very rich.
I worked myself off. I have to take my sweater off. Yes.
Well, yeah, while you do that, I'm just trying to pick a few really good questions here. Caroline loves the concept of risking to gain. As an artist yourself, what role can the arts continue to play moving forward?
I mean, for me, the arts are everything. One of the things that I love about the arts is the idea, and I understand the arts as a business has its own troubles and challenges and boundaries and limitations. But arts as a foundational idea, as a thinking, a way to be creative, and everybody for me is creative, right? There's no limit to who is creative and what that looks like. It's suddenly like the difference. I've said to people, someone said to me once, if somebody doesn't want to engage with you, you should take your toys and go play in another sandbox. And my response to them was, well, I don't want to play in the sandbox. I want to play on the beach. And the arts is like playing on the beach, right? There's no boundary. The potential for making connections between this and this over here, a piece of music, a word from the written page, an image, a dream, a sound. I mean, you can put everything about who we are as human beings and everything that we are not as human beings together and create an opening. The arts are also about play. Play. Yeah, you know what? This is some serious stuff we're talking about. But because we're complicated and complex, there is no reason why we can't play at it too. Because actually, for me, the backdoor strategy, I call the sidestep strategy, like sometimes you have to duck and weave around the thing in order to get to the thing because you're trying to connect with people over something that's really sensitive. You know, people who feel guilt, shame, anger, fear, you know, all those things are human things, right? So people feel those things. And play gives people a sideways way in, and the arts, I think, can bring that in. And it kind of throws people off the kilter for a second in the best way, when suddenly you're asking them to play, play with this. And then here's how you can bring that to this over here with the same kind of rigor. For me, doing this work isn't about being serious all the time. Doing this work is about being rigorous and clear about your attention to your intention. And if you're clear about your intention and what the vision is for what it is you want to do, you will service it however you need to. And so the arts for me really opens up that door in a very particular way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's, you know, it's frankly one of the reasons that I love our book club. We're always going from one topic to the next, and we may do a novel one, and we can all find some little pieces of connectivity. I promised to give a couple books away, by the way, thinking of that, and I have our two winners tonight. We have two books. Dirt Work is coming up next month, which is kind of the real story of working in the trails. Christine Bile is going to be with us from Alaska. She's awesome. And then in December, we're going to close out the year with a book edited by one of our own board members, Jermaine White, who on behalf of the Salish and Kootenai Culture Committee edited a book called The Salish People and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. So Bonnie, you are our lucky first winner. So text me in the chat which one of those you would like, and I will make that so. And our second winner, I've got to go back. I got to scroll up in this very long, great chat that we've got going. Dave Baylor, you are our second winner, so I will be sending you the one that Bonnie doesn't choose. And I also want to thank Carolyn. You were very gracious to be able to agree to do book plates for folks who want them. So if you would like a book plate, please email Grace at glacier.org, and Grace will make all that magic happen with Carolyn, and we'll get that done. Carolyn, one of the questions I wanted to ask, since we have you, you know, we're the nonprofit partner of Glacier National Park, right? And when we talk about risking to gain, I wanted to kind of see if you had any thinking about how we, as a partner, a friends group who gives the park $2 million a year on average, how we can risk that to gain. You know, how can we leverage that in an appropriate, do what you talked about when we began this discussion, which is creating motion and not just direction.
Woo! Well, without knowing the details, you see how Doug left that to the last few minutes, and now I got to answer that. Just laid that in front of me. Okay. So without knowing the details and you know how you use that money and how you share that money, I do remember when I served on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, and so it's when I became aware of friends groups and really understanding the way that nonprofit and non-park people work and help to support and be in good relationship with parks so that they can do what they do. You know, my question, you know, if I was sitting down with you to be, so what do you already do with that money? And what does it mean to actually, so, you know, this is hard for me because I don't have all the details of where you live and how the money is used. But lately, you know, I've heard from other groups that are right here in Vermont, actually. There was one in particular where there was a lot of money, and what they decided to do with a big chunk, it was when some big philanthropy group said that what they're doing, which they've never done before, is they're giving a big chunk of that money to BIPOC groups, community groups who are doing a certain kind of diversity and or environmental justice work. And, you know, it's not just completely free, but it's understanding that at the same time, they are recognizing that the rules of the game are different and they have to be, right? It is like, how do you, nobody knows everything, but say you have a group of color that's been doing environmental justice group and living in a community for their for years and years and years. They embody it, they know it, they may not have multiple degrees or national standing, but what they have is lived experience, which is no less important. It may even be more important, right? They understand it in a really visceral way. So in handling the money, they actually know where the money needs to go. And it may not fit where you think it needs to go, because this is the way you've been doing it for a long time. This, for me, is part of the risk. And I think the risk can be mitigated if there's a relationship. This is why a relationship is so important. You know, if you're building a relationship, which takes time, this is why it's also the long game. You know, I know people want to talk about the urgency, you know, of the moment, whether it's climate change, you know, all the things that are urgent. And I want to say to you, there's people who've been living in a state of urgency for the last 400 years. You know, depending on who you are, there's always a state of emergency. There are people who are living in it right now. And I think the thing that serves us all collectively is how we show up to that moment, and we're just not throwing things at it or leaping, maybe doing more harm than good, or something that's not going to have lasting effect, because our good intention is we want to take care of it really quickly, but we're still doing the same thing we've always done. Whereas that, how far down the road is that really going to get us? The other thing is going to take longer. But there's something about building those routes differently. That's part of the risk. What does it mean even when you have a meeting? You know, so I'm on boards and meetings, and part of what I sometimes want to say, it's so interesting, and I say this gently, about people will invite in someone different because they want to do something different. But we have to buy, or we're going to have a symposium, or we're going to the conference. And the model is exactly the same. There's no room for anything different. You know, I'm working with a big group now, and on them, as I think about their big conference they want to have, I said, you actually have to change the formula. That's the risk. So it actually makes space for those different things. And yeah, so when it starts to, when I can see you start to get the confused look on your face, I'm like, oh, it's working. Hercules, Hercules, Hercules. Something good is happening right now because you don't know what's happening, which doesn't mean you can't figure out how to do it. And I guess that's part of the risk of the money, is to talk about how do you invite, instead of whoever the inner circle is that makes the decision about how that money gets spent, how do you change that inner circle?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have a series of engagements with other groups of people to say, like, we're trying to, and being transparent. Oh, nobody likes to talk about money. It's all about the money in terms of how we can make substantial things happening. Let's not pretend anymore. And money is about power, right? And it's also about privilege. And it is also about potential and opportunity. What happens if you open up that circle and have an invitation and say, we want to think differently about how we spend our money? And we've got limited ideas about that because there's only a certain amount of us in the room. Let's open up that circle. That'll blow a few minds.
Well, I think that you have opened up a lot of minds tonight in a lot of circles. My takeaway from that great answer to what I apologize was kind of a tough question is, let's get uncomfortable. Right. And I think that, you know,
and Doug, and build up your muscles. It's like everything. You're building up that's right. You're building up your muscles, you know, the inner ones, the outer ones. It's practice. That's the other thing I tell people. For me, this is a practice. Yeah. It is ongoing. From the minute you reached out to me in an email, I tell people reach out all the time. The minute I decide to respond, the practice begins. Because I'm thinking about the relationship. I'm not thinking about how much money you're going to pay me. Yeah, I'm thinking about that too. But that's not the motivation. I'm thinking about, how do I engage you honestly in a way that creates an opening, whether or not we end up working together or not, because that's the thing that gets perpetuated over and over. And I just want to get better at it. So yeah, sometimes it's not going to work out for whatever reasons, but it doesn't mean we can't still meet in a good place and do that well.
And well, like it or not, you are now part of the Glacier family.
All right, I'm in.
So you have roughly 70 places you can now stay with anyone in Glacier National Park.
I love how you just invited me to everybody else's house.
Yeah, for
fabulous.
sure. That's the kind of people we are around here. Sometimes we even lock our doors, but not usually.
Okay.
Carolyn Finney, thank you so much I want to be respectful of your time. This was an incredibly engaging evening that will live long in our memory. And thank you for enriching our lives and the lives of others with whom you are so generously sharing this important work that you do. Thank you very much.
Well, and again, thank you all for working on it and doing the work that you do as well, and kind of showing up to meet me here. And I want to hope to see you all out in the world soon.
I know. Come and take a walk with us.
Yeah, I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna show up on your doorstep.
Good. We love it. Hey, thanks everybody for another great Glacier Book Club dirt work next month. And Carolyn Finney, thank you.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.